The Galactic Council couldn't understand why the galaxy feared humanity. Ambassador Kelrin of the Civathy Collective adjusted his translator implant as he entered the grand chamber of the Galactic Council. His scales shimmered under the artificial lighting, a nervous habit he had developed over his 300 years of diplomatic service. Today's session was supposed to be routine, just another evaluation of potential member species. But the whispers in the corridors suggested otherwise. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering. A massive sphere suspended in the void of space, held together by gravitational anchors and shielded by technology older than most civilizations. Representatives from 47 species sat in their designated sections, each area modified to accommodate their unique environmental needs. The Aquarians floated in pressurized water tubes. The methane breathers occupied their sealed chambers. The silicon-based Kroner rested on heated platforms. All of them were united by one common purpose: maintaining order in a chaotic galaxy. Council Speaker Thamus, a crystalline being whose body refracted light into 1,000 colors, called the session to order. His voice resonated through every translator in the chamber, a harmonious frequency that demanded attention. Esteemed members of the Council, we gather today to address a matter that has caused considerable confusion among our ranks. 3 cycles ago, we extended an invitation to the species known as humanity to join our council as probationary members. They accepted. Their diplomatic team was scheduled to arrive within the next solar rotation. However, we have received troubling reports from various sectors. A holographic display materialized in the center of the chamber. It showed a star map with dozens of systems highlighted in red. Kelrin leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. He recognized several of those systems. They were independent territories, pirate havens, and corporate dominions that had long refused council authority. These systems, Thamus continued, have all issued formal declarations in the past 2 cycles. They have ceased all hostile activities against council shipping lanes. They have released prisoners. They have even offered reparations for past grievances. When questioned about this sudden change of heart, every single one of them gave the same reason. They do not wish to provoke humanity. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Kelrin exchanged glances with Ambassador Yerith, a gaseous being contained within an environmental suit. Her confusion matched his own. "This makes no sense," Yerith's translated voice crackled. "The humans are a young species. According to our surveys, they achieved faster-than-light travel only 237 of their years ago. They control exactly 18 star systems. Their military consists of perhaps 300 capital ships. Why would the Corvin Syndicate, with their fleet of 2,000 warships, fear such a minor power?" Thamus gestured, and new data appeared. "That is precisely the question we must answer. Our intelligence division has compiled extensive records on humanity. By every conventional metric, they should be insignificant. Their technology is derivative, based on translated council archives we provided during first contact. Their economy is modest. Their population, while growing, is unremarkable. Yet somehow, they have acquired a reputation that makes hardened warlords retreat." Kelrin accessed his personal datapad, scrolling through the human profile. He had reviewed it before, of course. Standard procedure for any new potential member. The humans were biologically unremarkable, carbon-based mammals from a world they called Earth. They reproduced slowly compared to many species. They were fragile, requiring narrow environmental conditions to survive. They had no natural armor, no venom, no enhanced sensory capabilities. On paper, they seemed almost comically ill-suited for space colonization, yet here they were, inspiring fear across the galaxy. "Perhaps we should examine the specific incidents," suggested Ambassador Roque. A massive insectoid whose species had earned their council seat through centuries of trade expertise. Fear does not materialize from nothing. There must be events that created this perception. Themis nodded, and the holographic display shifted. It now showed a timeline of human interactions with other species over the past 2 centuries. The first entry made Kelleran's scales bristle. 183 years ago, shortly after humanity had developed their crude warp drives, a human exploration vessel had encountered a Skrell raiding party. The Skrell were notorious pirates, their species having evolved in the lawless outer reaches where council authority held no sway. They had demanded the human ship's cargo and threatened to take the crew as slaves. The human response had been unexpected. Instead of surrendering or attempting to flee, the exploration ship had rammed the largest Skrell vessel at full warp speed. Both ships had been destroyed instantly, but the explosion had crippled 2 other Skrell raiders. The remaining human crew, aboard a smaller auxiliary craft, had then broadcast a message across all frequencies. You can have our cargo when you pry it from our cold, dead hands. And we promise we'll take you with us. Irrational, muttered Kelleran. Suicide tactics from an exploration vessel? This cannot be standard human doctrine. But the timeline showed more incidents. 17 years later, a human colony on the edge of their territory had been threatened by a Thaxian corporate fleet. The Thaxians wanted the mineral rights to the system and believed they could intimidate the small human settlement. The colonists had responded by rigging their entire settlement with fusion explosives and threatening to detonate them if the Thaxians didn't withdraw. They broadcast detailed calculations showing that the explosion would create a debris field that would make the system unminiable for 3,000 years. The Thaxians had retreated. They would have destroyed themselves, Irith observed, over mineral rights. This is madness. Themis let the timeline continue. More incidents appeared, each one more confusing than the last. Humans who fought with damaged ships when they should have surrendered. Human merchants who destroyed their own cargo rather than let pirates take it. Human diplomats who threatened economic sanctions that would hurt their own economy just to make a point. Human soldiers who carried weapons capable of devastating entire regions, apparently unconcerned that they were standing at ground zero. One incident in particular caught Kelleran's attention. 73 years ago, a human diplomatic vessel had been captured by the Zarthan Empire. The Zarthans, confident in their superior numbers, had demanded territorial concessions. The human ambassador had calmly informed them that his ship's AI had been programmed to send humanity's complete technological database to the 17 most aggressive species in the galaxy if he failed to check in every 48 hours. The data included weapons specifications, tactical analyses of council defenses, and detailed star maps of human territory. He would have armed our enemies, Kelleran breathed, armed them with knowledge that would destabilize the entire sector. Just to save himself. Not just himself, Themis corrected. The database was real. We verified it afterward. The ambassador was willing to create a technological arms race that could have led to war spanning millennia, all to establish a single diplomatic principle. That humanity could not be coerced. The chamber fell silent. Kelleran's mind raced, trying to understand the psychology behind such actions. Every species had survival instincts. Every civilization valued self-preservation. But humans seemed to operate on a different calculation entirely. They treated mutually assured destruction not as a deterrent of last resort, but as an opening negotiating position. There's a pattern here, Roke observed, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. In every incident, humans chose the option that maximized damage to their opponents, even when it meant certain harm to themselves. They don't surrender. They don't retreat. They escalate until the other side backs down or everyone dies. Evolutionary pressure, suggested a Veronian biologist from the upper tiers. Earth must have been an extraordinarily hostile world. Only the most aggressive, most willing to fight, could have survived to develop civilization. Themis displayed new data, Earth's planetary profile. Kelleran studied it with growing unease. The planet was indeed hostile by most standards. Extreme weather patterns, volcanic activity, an atmosphere that had apparently been toxic until plant life had converted it. Countless predator species, many of which had apparently viewed early humans as prey. And perhaps most telling, humans had spent most of their evolutionary history competing not just against their environment, but against each other. They warred amongst themselves for their entire history, Urith noted. Even now, their unified government is barely 2 centuries old. Before that, they were divided into hundreds of competing factions. Kelleran felt a chill despite the chamber's regulated temperature. He was beginning to understand why the galaxy feared humanity. The Galactic Council couldn't understand why the galaxy feared humanity. A council session continued for another 3 hours, with various ambassadors presenting their own theories and concerns. Kelleran listened carefully, but his mind kept returning to a fundamental question that no one seemed willing to address directly. If humans were so dangerous, so unpredictable, why had the council invited them to join in the first place? During the recess period, he decided to do something unusual. Rather than networking with other ambassadors, as protocol suggested, Kelleran retreated to his private chamber and accessed the restricted council archives. His clearance level allowed him to review classified intelligence reports, and he wanted to see what the council's actual assessment of humanity had been before the invitation was extended. What he found surprised him. The official evaluation report, compiled by a team of xenopsychologists and military analysts, was remarkably positive. Humans were described as adaptable, intelligent, and surprisingly diplomatic despite their violent history. Their technology was advancing rapidly. Their cultural output showed creativity and philosophical depth. They had managed to unify their species after centuries of conflict, which demonstrated political maturity. The report recommended probationary membership with standard observation protocols. There was a second report, though buried deeper in the archives. This one was flagged as speculative analysis, prepared by a single council observer named Maxis, who had spent 30 years living among humans. Kelleran opened it and began to read. It is my assessment that the council fundamentally misunderstands the nature of human aggression, Maxis had written. They are not violent because they are primitive or because they lack empathy. They are violent because they have weaponized hope. Kelleran paused. Weaponized hope? That made no sense. He continued reading. Humans possess an unusual psychological trait that I have observed repeatedly during my time among them. When faced with impossible odds, rather than accepting defeat, they become more creative, more determined. They start looking for solutions that other species would never consider, because those solutions require sacrifice that seems irrational. A human soldier surrounded by enemies doesn't calculate his odds of survival. He calculates how many enemies he can take with him, and whether his sacrifice will buy time for his comrades. A human scientist facing an unsolvable problem doesn't give up. She works for decades on the assumption that a solution must exist, even if no one else believes it. The report included dozens of examples from human history. Kelleran read about ancient human civilizations that had defeated vastly superior forces through tactics that relied on their own soldiers dying in specific ways. He read about human explorers who had ventured into environments that should have killed them, sustained only by the belief that they would somehow survive. He read about human engineers who had solved problems by building machines that had a significant chance of killing them during testing. The galaxy fears humanity because humans don't accept the concept of acceptable losses, Maxis concluded. Every other species understands that sometimes you must retreat. Sometimes you must surrender. Sometimes you must accept that a goal is unattainable. Humans understand these concepts intellectually, but they don't internalize them emotionally. They treat every loss as temporary, every defeat as a setback, every impossible problem as a puzzle waiting to be solved. This makes them terrifying opponents because they never stay beaten. Kelrun closed the report and sat in silence for a long moment. He thought about the incidents the council had reviewed. The exploration ship that rammed the pirates. The colonists who threatened to destroy their own settlement. The ambassador who would have armed humanity's enemies. None of those had been acts of irrationality. They had been calculated decisions made by people who refused to accept defeat, even when defeat was the logical outcome. His communicator chimed. The council session was resuming. Kelrun made his way back to the Grand Chamber, his mind still processing what he had learned. When he arrived, he found the atmosphere had changed. The earlier confusion had evolved into something more heated. Several ambassadors were arguing loudly, their translators struggling to keep up with the rapid exchange. We cannot allow a species this unstable into the council, Ambassador Druvik of the Praetoran Federation was saying. His species was known for their military prowess, and his concern was evident. They are a threat to galactic stability. On the contrary, countered Ambassador Telson of the Commerce Guilds, they are exactly what the Council needs. The criminal syndicates have terrorized shipping lanes for centuries. The Council's military has never been able to stop them because they simply retreat when we attack and resume operations elsewhere. But humans have made them genuinely afraid. For the first time in my lifetime, piracy rates are declining. Because the pirates think humans will do something insane if provoked, Druvik shot back. That's not law and order. That's chaos masquerading as deterrence. Thamus called for order, his crystalline body pulsing with light. Ambassadors, please. We are not here to debate whether humans should join the Council. That decision has already been made. They have accepted our invitation. They will arrive tomorrow. What we must decide is how to interact with them, how to integrate them into our structures, and how to prevent the misunderstandings that could lead to conflict. Yirith's voice cut through the murmurs. Perhaps we should ask them directly about their philosophy, their intentions, their methods. We have been analyzing them from a distance, treating them as a puzzle to be solved. But they are sentient beings. They can explain themselves. It was a simple suggestion, but it seemed to calm the chamber. Several ambassadors indicated their agreement. Kelrun found himself supporting the idea as well. Despite everything he had learned, he realized he still didn't truly understand humans. He understood their actions, but not the motivations behind those actions. The session continued, with various practical matters being discussed. Protocols for the human delegation's arrival, security arrangements, accommodation requirements. But beneath the bureaucratic details, Kelrun sensed a current of anxiety running through the council. They were preparing to welcome a species that made warlords nervous, and none of them were entirely sure what that meant for the future. That evening, Kelrun decided to do more research. He accessed the human information networks, which they had opened to council observers as a gesture of transparency. He spent hours reading human literature, watching their entertainment, studying their history. What struck him most was not the violence, which was certainly present, but the context in which it appeared. Human stories were full of characters who faced overwhelming odds and won through determination and sacrifice. Their historical records celebrated individuals who had changed the course of civilization by refusing to give up. Their philosophies emphasized perseverance, resilience, and the belief that individuals could make a difference, even against vast systems of power. One human concept particularly fascinated him. They called it spite. It referred to taking action purely to prevent an enemy from winning, even if that action brought no benefit to oneself. Humans apparently considered this not just acceptable, but sometimes admirable. There were human sayings about it. Cutting off your nose to spite your face was considered foolish, but going down swinging was considered heroic. Kelleran tried to imagine a civethy acting out of spite. His species valued harmony, cooperation, and logical decision-making. If a fight was unwinnable, they surrendered and sought better terms. If a negotiation was going poorly, they compromised. The idea of continuing a hopeless fight just to make the enemy's victory more expensive seemed alien to everything his culture valued. Yet humans had built their entire civilization on that principle. They had conquered their hostile planet not by adapting to its dangers, but by reshaping the environment to suit their needs. They had unified their species not through natural cooperation, but by making continued warfare so devastating that peace became the only rational choice. They had reached the stars not because space welcomed them, but because they refused to accept that their homeworld was their only option. He found a human philosophical text that seemed to encapsulate their worldview. It was ancient, written thousands of years before they had achieved spaceflight. The passage read, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." Kelleran read it several times, trying to parse its meaning through his translator. The humans were advocating for fighting against inevitable death itself, not seeking immortality through technology or hoping for an afterlife, but simply refusing to accept the end peacefully. It was the most human thing he had encountered in all his research. His communicator chimed again. A priority message from Council Intelligence. Kelleran opened it and felt his scales ripple with surprise. The human delegation had arrived early. They were requesting permission to dock within the next hour. The galaxy was about to meet humanity face to face. And despite all his research, all his analysis, Kelleran realized he had no idea what to expect. The Galactic Council couldn't understand why the galaxy feared humanity. The docking bay was crowded with council officials, security personnel, and representatives from a dozen different species, all waiting to catch their first glimpse of the human delegation. Kelleran stood among them, his diplomatic training keeping his posture neutral despite the nervous energy coursing through his body. Around him, he could hear whispered conversations in multiple languages, speculation and concern mixing freely. The human ship approached through the docking port's atmospheric shield. Kelleran had seen the technical specifications, but seeing it in person was different. The vessel was surprisingly elegant, a sleek design that spoke of function over decoration. It bore markings in human script and in council standard, along with a symbol that intelligence had identified as the flag of Earth's unified government, a blue circle representing their planet. Surrounded by stars as the ship settled into its berth, Kelleran noticed something interesting. The security personnel around him had tensed, their hands moving closer to weapons they all pretended not to carry. These were trained professionals, veterans of countless diplomatic receptions, yet the mere presence of a human ship had put them on edge. The reputation that had concerned the council was clearly not limited to criminals and warlords. The airlock cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The first human to emerge was a woman in a formal uniform of deep blue, decorated with insignia that Kelleran's briefing materials identified as diplomatic rank markers. She was shorter than he had expected, barely reaching his shoulder despite her species' reputation. Her skin was dark brown, her hair cut short, and her eyes swept across the assembled crowd with an expression that was difficult to read. Behind her came 4 more humans, 2 men and 2 women, each carrying themselves with quiet confidence. One of them had skin so pale it was almost white. Another had features that suggested East Asian heritage, and the others showed the mixed ancestry that apparently characterized humanity's unified population. They wore similar uniforms, but carried different equipment, suggesting various roles within the delegation. The lead diplomat stepped forward and executed what Kelleran recognized from his research as a human bow, a gesture of respect from their cultural traditions. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, and her translator implant rendered her words in flawless council standard. Honored members of the Galactic Council, I am Ambassador Sarah Chun of the United Earth Government. On behalf of my species, I thank you for this invitation and the opportunity to join the community of spacefaring civilizations. We come in peace, with open hands and open minds, hoping to build lasting friendships among the stars. It was a perfectly diplomatic statement, exactly what protocol required. Yet Kelleran noticed that several council officials seemed almost disappointed. What had they expected? Threats? Displays of aggression? The humans had done nothing but offer polite greetings, yet the tension in the room remained thick. Thamus moved forward, his crystalline body refracting the docking bay's lights into rainbow patterns. Welcome, Ambassador Chun. We are pleased to receive you and your delegation. If you will follow me, we have prepared accommodations for you, and tomorrow we will begin the formal introduction process. The human ambassador smiled, an expression that Kelleran knew could mean many things in human culture. Actually, if I may, I was hoping we could speak informally before the official proceedings begin. I understand there have been concerns raised about my species. I think it would benefit everyone if we addressed those concerns directly, rather than allowing them to fester. A murmur ran through the assembled officials. This was not standard protocol. New species typically followed a careful schedule of introductions and orientations. But Thamus seemed to consider the request, his body pulsing thoughtfully. That is unusual, Ambassador, but perhaps wise. Very well. We will convene a private session in Conference Chamber 7. Council members only, if that is acceptable. More than acceptable. Thank you. 20 minutes later, Kelleran found himself in one of the council's smaller conference chambers, designed for intimate discussions rather than grand assemblies. About 30 council members had been invited, representing the major factions and interests. The humans sat on one side of the long table, the council members arrayed around the rest of it. Ambassador Chun waited until everyone was settled, then spoke without preamble. I'm going to be direct, because I believe that's what this situation requires. You're afraid of us. Not all of you, perhaps, but enough that it's affecting your decision-making. I need to understand why, and then we need to figure out if your fear is justified or based on misunderstandings. The bluntness caught several ambassadors off guard. Irith was the first to respond. We have reviewed numerous incidents involving your species, Ambassador. Your methods of conflict resolution are concerning. You seem willing to accept casualties and damage that other species would consider unacceptable. Chun nodded slowly. You're talking about the incidents with the Skrell pirates, the Faxian corporations, and others. Yes, I'm familiar with those events. They're taught in our diplomatic academy as case studies. May I ask you something? In each of those situations, what would your species have done? We would have negotiated, Irith said. Sought compromise. Accepted some losses to prevent greater ones. And if the other side had no interest in compromise? If they believed you would always back down if they applied enough pressure? Then we would retreat and seek council intervention. But what if you didn't have a council to appeal to? Chun leaned forward slightly. For most of our history, we didn't. Earth had no unified government, no higher authority to arbitrate disputes. If you backed down from a fight, you didn't get to try again later. You lost. Your people were conquered, enslaved, or killed. The only way to survive was to make attacking you more expensive than leaving you alone. Kelleran spoke up, his translator carrying the hissing quality of his native language. But you are no longer isolated tribes on your homeworld. You have achieved space travel, established colonies, built a civilization. Surely those old survival strategies are no longer necessary? Chun turned to look at him, and Kelrin was struck by the intelligence in her eyes. She was evaluating him, he realized, just as thoroughly as he was evaluating her. Ambassador Kelrin of the Sivithy Collective, correct? You raise a fair point. And you're right that our circumstances have changed. But here's what you need to understand about humans. We don't just carry our history with us. We learn from it. Every time we faced extinction and survived, we learned that survival was possible if we were willing to pay the price. Every time we faced an impossible enemy and won, we learned that impossibility is often just another word for difficult. She stood up and walked to the chamber's viewport, looking out at the stars beyond. When the Skrell attacked that exploration ship, they weren't just threatening cargo. They were establishing a precedent. If humans surrendered to pirates, then every pirate in the galaxy would know we were easy targets. Our early colonies would have been raided constantly. Our shipping would have required massive military escorts we couldn't afford. So yes, that exploration crew destroyed their own ship. But in doing so, they sent a message that saved thousands of lives in the years that followed. You cannot know that, Druvik challenged. You are speculating about what might have happened. Am I? Chun turned back to face the assembly. After that incident, how many times were human ships attacked by pirates? According to council records, attacks on human vessels decreased by 73% within 2 years. The attacks that did occur were mostly by new pirate groups who hadn't heard the stories yet. Once they learned, they stopped. We achieved through one act of defiance what your council has failed to achieve with centuries of military patrols. We made piracy against our ships economically non-viable. Kelrin had to admit she had a point. The council's approach to piracy had always been reactive, responding to attacks after they occurred and rarely catching the perpetrators. The pirates simply moved to new hunting grounds. But if the prey itself became dangerous, the entire equation changed, that another council member, Ambassador Jorith of the Scientific Coalition, spoke up. I want to return to something you said earlier. Ambassador Chun, you mentioned that impossibility is just another word for difficult. This concerns me because it suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of physical reality. Some things are actually impossible, not merely difficult. Chun smiled again, and this time Kelrin recognized it as the expression humans made when they found something amusing. Give me an example. Faster-than-light travel was considered impossible by your species scientists until you discovered it was possible. Anti-gravity technology, fusion power, quantum computing, all impossible until they weren't. What you call impossible, we call an engineering problem we haven't solved yet. That is dangerously arrogant, Jorith said flatly. Perhaps. But it's also why we're here. Your species had faster-than-light travel for thousands of years before we achieved it. Yet within 2 centuries of reaching the stars, we've colonized 18 systems and developed technology that rivals your own in several fields. How do you think we accomplished that? By being reckless, suggested another embassy. The Galactic Council couldn't understand why the galaxy feared humanity. The discussion continued for another 2 hours, ranging across topics from human military doctrine to cultural philosophy to economic policy. Kelrin listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, always learning. What emerged was a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of violent primitives that some council members had suggested. Humans, he came to understand, operated on multiple levels simultaneously. They were genuinely committed to peace and cooperation, as evidenced by their successful planetary unification and their eager acceptance of the Council's invitation. But underneath that commitment was a foundation of iron will that would not bend even when breaking seemed inevitable. Ambassador, Chun explained it through a human historical example. In our 20th century, there was a war that threatened to consume our entire planet. One nation developed weapons, capable of destroying cities in single explosions. Within a few years, multiple nations possessed these weapons. Everyone understood that if they were used, civilization itself might end. So how did we prevent their use? Deterrence through mutually assured destruction, Uret said. We studied this period of your history. It seemed insane to us. You built weapons that could kill everyone, and promised to use them if attacked, knowing that doing so would mean your own destruction. It did seem insane, Sean agreed. And yet it worked. For decades, those weapons kept the peace because everyone knew that starting a war meant ending the world. Eventually, we found better ways to resolve our conflicts. But the principle remains valid. Sometimes, the willingness to destroy yourself is the only thing that prevents someone else from destroying you. Druvik, who had been largely silent since Chun's arrival, suddenly spoke. You speak of these things so calmly, Ambassador. Do you not find it disturbing? This philosophy of mutual destruction, of accepting death rather than defeat. For the first time, Chun's expression showed something other than diplomatic neutrality. Her features softened, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Of course it disturbs us. Do you think we enjoy having to make such calculations? Every human who died fighting when they could have surrendered had a family, had dreams, had a life they wanted to live. Every colony we established in dangerous territory put thousands of civilians at risk. Every experimental ship that exploded killed brilliant scientists who could have contributed so much more if they had lived. We mourn those losses. We remember them. We build monuments and write songs and tell stories to make sure they are never forgotten. She paused, collecting herself. But we also honor the choices they made. They weren't victims. They were people who decided that some things were worth the risk, worth the sacrifice. And because they made those choices, billions of other humans get to live in relative safety and prosperity. That's the part you need to understand about us. We don't treat our dead as numbers in a casualty report. We treat them as individuals who bought our future with their lives. Kelrin felt something shift in his understanding. He had been thinking about human aggression as a military or political strategy. But it was deeper than that. It was cultural, emotional, even spiritual. Humans didn't just accept sacrifice as a tactical necessity. They elevated it to something meaningful, something worthy of remembrance and respect. One of the other human delegates, a man Chun had introduced as Dr. Marcus Webb, spoke for the first time. If I may add something, I'm a xenobiologist, and I've studied many of the species represented in this council. One thing I've noticed is that most of you evolved either as prey animals or as apex predators with few natural threats. Humans are unusual because we were prey that became predators. For millions of years, we were hunted by larger, stronger, faster creatures. We survived not by outrunning them or overpowering them, but by being smart enough to set traps, make weapons, and work together. He leaned forward, his hands gesturing as he spoke. This created a very specific psychological profile. We're simultaneously paranoid and confident. We assume threats are everywhere because for most of our evolution, they were. But we also believe we can overcome those threats because we always have. That combination makes us very good at survival, but it also makes us seem erratic to species that didn't face the same evolutionary pressures. You're saying your aggression is genetic? Joreth asked. That seems deterministic. No, Webb said firmly. I'm saying our capacity for aggression is genetic, just as it is for most species. But how we channel that aggression is cultural, learned, chosen. We could be a species of mindless violence. Some of our historical periods came close to that. But we're not. We're a species that harnesses aggression as a tool for survival and protection, while building civilizations based on cooperation, art, science, and philosophy. We contain multitudes, as one of our poets said. Thamus had been listening to all of this with what Kelrin was learning to recognize as intense focus. Now he spoke, his crystalline voice carrying the weight of his position as council speaker. I believe I am beginning to understand the situation more clearly. Humanity is not inherently more violent than other species. You are more willing to accept costs that others would avoid, which makes your responses difficult to predict. This unpredictability, combined with demonstrated capability, creates fear among those who might otherwise see you as targets or obstacles. Is this a fair assessment? Chun nodded. Very fair, Speaker Thamus. I would add only one thing. We don't want to be feared. Fear is a byproduct of our survival strategies, not a goal. We would much prefer to be respected, trusted, and welcomed as partners. That's why we're here. We accepted the Council's invitation because we believe that cooperation is better than competition, that mutual benefit is better than zero-sum conflict, and that the future of galactic civilization should be built on shared values rather than threats. But if cooperation fails? Druvik pressed. If conflict arises? Then we will defend ourselves and our interests with everything we have, Chun said simply. But we will also seek every possible avenue to avoid that outcome. We didn't unify our species by being inflexible, Ambassador Druvik. We learned to compromise, to negotiate, to find solutions that satisfied multiple competing interests. We're bringing those skills to the Council, along with our more famous determination. Kelrin decided it was time to ask the question that had been forming in his mind throughout the conversation. Ambassador Chun, what does humanity want from Council membership? What are your goals, your ambitions? Chun smiled again, and this time it seemed entirely genuine. Honestly, we want what most species want. Room to grow, opportunities to explore, trade partners, cultural exchange, scientific collaboration, and security for our people. We're not interested in conquest or domination. We already have more space than we can effectively colonize with our current population. What we lack is knowledge, experience, and connections. She gestured around the chamber. Every species here has something to teach us. The Civithi have centuries of diplomatic experience we could learn from. The scientific coalition has technology we can barely imagine. The commerce guilds understand economic systems on a scale we haven't encountered. We want to be students as much as contributors. We want to learn how to be part of something larger than ourselves. And if the Council asks you to change your ways, Yirith asked, to become less unpredictable, less threatening to galactic stability? Chun's expression became serious again. We can commit to transparency about our capabilities and intentions. We can follow Council protocols and respect established laws. We can work to build trust through consistent action over time. But we cannot and will not fundamentally change who we are as a species. Our resilience, our determination, our willingness to pay costs that others won't, these are not bugs in our programming that need to be fixed. They are core features that have enabled our survival and success. Asking us to abandon them would be like asking the Aquarians to abandon water or the Kroner to abandon heat. There was a long pause as the Council members processed this. Finally, Kelrin spoke again, choosing his words carefully. I think the real question before us is not whether humanity is dangerous. Clearly, you are, though perhaps not in the ways we initially feared. The question is whether that danger can coexist with the Council's mission of promoting peace and cooperation across the galaxy. Can a species built on the willingness to fight to the death also be trusted as a partner in maintaining order? Chun met his gaze directly. Ambassador Kelrin, let me tell you a secret about humanity. We're not actually eager to fight. Fighting is expensive, dangerous, and uncertain, even when you win. What we're eager to do is protect what we value, our people, our freedom, our future. If the Council can offer us a framework where those things are secure, where our interests are respected and protected through law rather than through threat of force, then we will be the Council's strongest supporters. We've been waiting for 2 centuries to find something like this. A community of civilizations working together instead of against each other. She stood up and walked slowly around the table as she spoke, making eye contact with different council members. But if the council proves to be just another power structure that respects only strength,